The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pacific as Admiral Chester William Nimitz stood on the bridge of his flagship, staring out at the endless expanse of blue water. It was early June 1942, 6 months after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor had shaken America to its core. The smell of salt air mixed with the acrid scent of diesel fuel as the massive naval task force prepared for what would become one of the most decisive battles in naval history. Intelligence reports had been flooding in for weeks. The Japanese, drunk on their string of victories across the Pacific, were planning something massive. Their next target, Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand that held strategic importance far beyond its size. From Midway, Japanese forces could threaten Hawaii itself, potentially forcing the United States to sue for peace in the Pacific theater. Commander Joseph John Rochefort, the brilliant cryptanalyst stationed at Pearl Harbor, had been working around the clock with his team of codebreakers. Their work on breaking the Japanese naval code, designated JN-25, had yielded fragments of intelligence that painted a terrifying picture. The Japanese combined fleet, under the command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was assembling the largest naval force in their nation's history. According to historical accounts from the Naval History and Heritage Command, Rochefort's team had identified the target through an ingenious deception. When intercepted messages repeatedly mentioned AF as the objective, Rochefort ordered Midway's garrison to broadcast a fake message about water shortages. Within days, Japanese communications referenced F having water problems, confirming Midway as the target. The American response was swift but desperate. Nimitz knew he was facing overwhelming odds. The Japanese fleet would include 4 of their most powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These floating airfields had spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor and had proven virtually unstoppable across the Pacific. Supporting them would be battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and transport ships carrying thousands of troops for the invasion. Against this armada, Nimitz could muster only 3 carriers: the USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown. The Yorktown had limped back to Pearl Harbor after the Battle of the Coral Sea, her flight deck scarred and her hull bearing the wounds of Japanese bombs. Navy engineers worked feverishly for 72 hours straight, performing repairs that should have taken months in just 3 days. The weight of command pressed heavily on Nimitz's shoulders as he contemplated the coming battle. Defeat would leave the west coast of the United States vulnerable to Japanese attack and could force America to fight a purely defensive war. Victory, however unlikely, could turn the tide of the entire Pacific War. As the American fleet steamed toward Midway, every sailor aboard understood the stakes. They were sailing toward what Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance would later describe as a calculated risk that would either save or doom the American war effort in the Pacific. The stage was set for a confrontation that would depend as much on luck and timing as on courage and tactical brilliance. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the flagship Akagi, watching his pilots conduct their final briefings. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, the veteran commander who had led the successful attack on Pearl Harbor felt the familiar mixture of confidence and tension that preceded major naval operations. Around him, the largest carrier force ever assembled by the Japanese Navy cut through the Pacific swells toward their destiny at Midway. The Japanese plan was characteristically complex and ambitious. Admiral Yamamoto had divided his forces into multiple groups, hoping to confuse and overwhelm the Americans through sheer numbers and tactical superiority. The northern force would strike the Aleutian Islands as a diversion, drawing American attention away from the main assault. Meanwhile, Nagumo's mobile force would soften up Midway's defenses before the invasion fleet landed troops to capture the atoll. What the Japanese didn't know was that their every move was being tracked by American intelligence. The codebreakers at Pearl Harbor had not only identified the target and timing, but had also provided Nimitz with detailed information about Japanese fleet movements and attack plans. This intelligence advantage would prove crucial in the coming battle, though its true value remained hidden beneath layers of tactical preparation and strategic positioning. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey prepared his dive bomber squadron aboard the USS Enterprise as the first rays of sunlight painted the horizon. The veteran pilot had been flying since the late 1930s and understood better than most the precarious nature of carrier aviation. One mistake, one moment of bad luck or poor timing, could send an entire squadron plummeting into the Pacific's depths. The American carriers had launched their first search planes before dawn, desperately trying to locate the Japanese fleet before being spotted themselves. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the Enterprise, knew that whoever struck first would likely determine the battle's outcome. Carrier warfare was a deadly game of hide-and-seek where the stakes were measured in ships, planes, and thousands of lives. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's definitive naval history, The Two-Ocean War, the morning search planes finally spotted the Japanese carriers at approximately 600 miles from Midway. The sighting report crackled over radio frequencies. 2 carriers and main body of ships, course 135 degrees, speed 25 knots. The race was on. Both fleets launched their attack aircraft almost simultaneously, setting up one of history's most dramatic examples of mutual assault. Japanese planes roared off the decks of their carriers, heading toward Midway's defenses, while American torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters climbed into the Pacific sky, seeking their targets among the enemy fleet. But the Japanese had made a critical error. Convinced that American carriers were still far from the battle area, Nagumo had armed his reserve aircraft with land attack bombs rather than armor-piercing weapons designed for use against ships. When scouts finally reported American naval forces in the area, frantic efforts began to rearm the planes with anti-ship weapons, a process that would take precious time and leave the carriers vulnerable. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be decided by split-second timing, tactical decisions made under extreme pressure, and the kind of luck that military historians spend decades trying to analyze and understand. The first wave of American attacks began disastrously. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying obsolete Douglas TBD Devastator aircraft from the USS Hornet, located the Japanese carriers at approximately 9:30 in the morning. Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron led his 15 aircraft in a low-level approach against the heavily defended enemy fleet, knowing full well that his squadron was flying into what amounted to a death trap. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, consisting of experienced Zero fighters, fell upon the slow-moving torpedo bombers, like hawks attacking sparrows. One by one, the American aircraft were shot down or crashed into the Pacific, their torpedoes either missing their targets or failing to explode upon impact. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 Devastators were destroyed, with only Ensign George Holden Gay surviving to float in the ocean and witness the remainder of the battle from his life raft. Similar fates befell Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown. The antiquated torpedo bombers, flying at wave-top level to deliver their weapons, were systematically destroyed by Japanese defenders. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese carriers that morning, only 6 returned to their ships. The sacrifice seemed meaningless, a tragic waste of brave air crews against an impregnable enemy defense. But the torpedo bomber attacks had accomplished something crucial, though none of the surviving American air crews realized it at the time. The Japanese Zero fighters had been drawn down to sea level to engage the torpedo planes, leaving the upper altitudes undefended. Their fuel was running low, and their ammunition was nearly exhausted from the prolonged combat against the American attackers. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 dive bombers from the Enterprise, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour. His fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels, and standing orders required him to turn back soon or risk losing his entire squadron when they ran out of gas short of their carriers. But McCluskey made a command decision that would change the course of the Pacific War. Spotting the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward, McCluskey correctly deduced that the ship was hurrying to rejoin the main fleet. Following the destroyer's course, his dive bombers finally spotted the Japanese carriers at approximately 10:22 in the morning. Below them, the enemy flight decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, their crews working frantically to prepare for another strike against American forces. As documented in Gordon Prang's comprehensive study, Miracle at Midway, the timing could not have been more perfect for the Americans or more disastrous for the Japanese. The carrier's defensive fighters were at low altitude and low fuel, having just finished massacring the torpedo bomber squadrons. The flight decks were covered with highly volatile aviation fuel and armed aircraft, creating what amounted to floating ammunition dumps. McCluskey's dive bombers rolled into their attacks, just as Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin Leslie's squadron from the Yorktown approached from a different angle. The Japanese carriers, caught completely off guard by the high-altitude assault, could offer virtually no defense against the screaming dive bombers plummeting toward their flight decks at terminal velocity. The next 4 minutes would determine the fate of the Pacific War and demonstrate how quickly fortune could shift in naval combat. At exactly 10:24 in the morning, the first American dive bomber released its 1,000-pound bomb above the Japanese carrier Kaga. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey watched through his bomb sight as the weapon arced downward toward the enemy flight deck, packed with refueling aircraft and armed with torpedoes and bombs. The ensuing explosion sent a column of fire and smoke hundreds of feet into the air, marking the beginning of what would become known as the fatal 5 minutes that decided the Battle of Midway. Within moments, bombs were falling on 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers. The Akagi, flagship of Admiral Nagumo's mobile force, took a direct hit that detonated ammunition stored near the bridge, killing most of the senior staff and leaving the ship's command structure in chaos. The carrier Soryu suffered multiple bomb hits that turned her flight deck into an inferno, trapping dozens of aircraft and their crews in a hellish maze of twisted metal and burning aviation fuel. The Kaga, veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack, absorbed at least 4 direct hits that penetrated her flight deck and exploded among the aircraft parked below. The ship's magazines began detonating in a chain reaction that could be heard for miles across the Pacific. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's most experienced and successful aircraft carriers were burning wrecks, their highly trained aircrews either dead or struggling to escape the consuming flames. Only the carrier Hiryu, positioned several miles away from her sister ships, escaped the initial American assault. Her captain, Tomeo Kaku, immediately ordered a counterattack with every available aircraft. The Japanese strike force, consisting of 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, set course for the American carriers with revenge burning in their hearts and the knowledge that their fleet's survival depended on their success. According to accounts preserved in the Naval War College Review, the Hiryu's attack aircraft located the USS Yorktown at approximately noon and pressed home a determined assault despite heavy anti-aircraft fire. 3 Japanese bombs penetrated the carrier's flight deck, causing significant damage and starting fires that temporarily knocked the ship out of action. American damage control teams worked frantically to restore power and resume flight operations, achieving what seemed impossible by getting the carrier operational again within hours. But the Japanese weren't finished. A second strike from the Hiryu, this time consisting of 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters, found the Yorktown again in the early afternoon. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier's port side, causing severe flooding and forcing the abandonment of the ship. The Yorktown, which had played such a crucial role in the morning's victory, now lay dead in the water, her crew struggling to save their ship from the Pacific's depths. The Americans, however, had not been idle during the Japanese counterattacks. Search planes from the Enterprise had located the Hiryu, and a strike force of 24 dive bombers was already winging toward the last operational Japanese carrier. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led the attack that would complete the morning's work of destruction. At approximately 5 in the evening, American dive bombers found the Hiryu and her escorts. The Japanese carrier, despite putting up fierce, anti-aircraft fire, could not escape the same fate that had befallen her sisters. 4 direct bomb hits turned the ship into a blazing wreck, eliminating Japan's last operational carrier in the Central Pacific and ensuring that Admiral Yamamoto's ambitious plan had ended in complete disaster. By sunset on June 4, 1942, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers lay burning or sunk, taking with them over 300 aircraft and many of Japan's most experienced pilots and aircrew. The psychological impact of the defeat would prove as devastating as the material losses, marking the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the full magnitude of the day's events began to dawn on both American and Japanese commanders. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato hundreds of miles away, received reports that seemed almost impossible to believe. Four of Japan's premier aircraft carriers, the heart of their naval striking power, had been destroyed in a single day by an American force that had been outnumbered nearly 3-1. The human cost of the victory was staggering on both sides. Japan had lost approximately 3,000 men, including many of their most experienced carrier pilots who had trained for years and participated in the attacks on Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies. These irreplaceable veterans, known as the first team among Japanese naval aviation circles, represented a level of skill and experience that would take years to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. American losses, while significant, were far lighter in comparison. The United States had lost one carrier, the Yorktown, along with approximately 300 men, most of whom had perished in the suicidal torpedo bomber attacks of the morning. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 and their fellow air crews had not been in vain. Their attacks had set up the decisive dive bomber strikes that turned the tide of the Pacific War. The strategic implications of the battle extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's offensive capability in the Central Pacific had been eliminated at a stroke, forcing them into a defensive posture from which they would never recover. The planned invasion of Midway was canceled, and Japanese forces that had been advancing steadily across the Pacific since Pearl Harbor suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering where the next American counterattack would fall, as documented in Ronald Spector's Eagle Against the Sun. The Battle of Midway marked the point where American industrial might begin to tip the balance of the Pacific War. While Japan struggled to replace their lost carriers and trained aircrew, American shipyards were already turning out new vessels at an unprecedented pace. The USS Essex, first of a new class of fast carriers, was nearing completion, and would be followed by dozens of sister ships that would form the backbone of America's Pacific offensive. The aftermath of the battle also highlighted the crucial role that intelligence had played in the American victory. The code breakers at Pearl Harbor, working in cramped windowless rooms filled with calculating machines and intercept equipment, had provided Admiral Nimitz with what amounted to a crystal ball view of Japanese intentions. Without this intelligence advantage, the American fleet would likely have been caught off guard and destroyed piecemeal by the superior Japanese force. Personal accounts from surviving Japanese officers revealed the psychological impact of the defeat. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and was aboard the Akagi during the Battle of Midway, later wrote that the loss of the four carriers marked the moment when many Japanese naval officers began to doubt their ability to win the war against American industrial capacity. The rescue operations that followed the battle demonstrated both the courage and the limitations of naval warfare in the Pacific. American ships and submarines worked for days to recover survivors from the water, while Japanese vessels attempted similar rescue efforts for their own personnel. The vast distances involved and the constant threat of submarine attack made these operations extremely dangerous, and many sailors from both sides were never recovered from the Pacific's depths. As the surviving ships of both fleets limped away from the battle area, the strategic landscape of the Pacific War had been fundamentally altered in the space of a few hours. In the weeks following the Battle of Midway, the reverberations of the American victory spread throughout the Pacific theater and beyond. Admiral Nimitz, understanding the psychological importance of the triumph, ensured that news of the victory reached every American unit fighting across the vast Pacific. From the jungles of Guadalcanal to the training bases in California, word spread that the supposedly invincible Japanese Navy had suffered a crushing defeat. The Japanese, meanwhile, struggled to conceal the magnitude of their losses from both their own people and their enemies. The four lost carriers were officially described as slightly damaged, and surviving crew members were quarantined upon their return to Japan to prevent word of the disaster from spreading. This secrecy, while maintaining morale in the short term, would prove counterproductive as Japanese military planners struggled to adapt to their new strategic reality without acknowledging the full extent of their losses. The battle's impact on carrier aviation doctrine was immediate and far-reaching. American naval theorists, studying the engagement's lessons, concluded that concentrated carrier task forces operating together provided the most effective means of projecting naval air power. This doctrine would guide the formation of the fast carrier task forces that would dominate the Pacific for the remainder of the war. Japanese naval aviation, by contrast, never fully recovered from the losses at Midway. The destruction of so many experienced pilots and aircrew created a training crisis that would only worsen as the war progressed. Replacement pilots, hastily trained and thrown into combat with minimal experience, proved no match for increasingly skilled American aviators who benefited from extended training programs and regular rotation back to instructor duties. The technological implications of the battle were equally significant. The failure of American torpedo bombers highlighted the urgent need for improved aircraft and weapons, leading to accelerated development programs that would produce superior torpedo bombers and more reliable torpedoes. Japanese overconfidence in their Zero fighters, meanwhile, led to complacency that would prove costly when American designers produced fighters specifically designed to counter Japanese advantages. The Battle of Midway also demonstrated the crucial importance of logistics in Pacific warfare. The ability to maintain and supply carrier task forces thousands of miles from their bases would determine which side could sustain offensive operations. American logistics capabilities, supported by a vast industrial base and protected supply lines, would prove superior to Japanese efforts hampered by extended communications and limited production capacity. Perhaps most importantly, Midway marked the psychological turning point of the Pacific War. Before the battle, Japanese forces had seemed unstoppable, advancing from victory to victory with apparent ease. After Midway, the aura of invincibility was shattered, and both sides understood that the momentum of the war had shifted decisively toward the United States. The courage displayed by American aircrews during the battle, particularly the torpedo bomber squadrons that attacked against hopeless odds, became legendary within the Navy and inspired a generation of naval aviators. Their sacrifice had demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming opposition, determination and courage could create opportunities for victory. As summer 1942 progressed into autumn, American forces began their first major offensive, operation of the Pacific War with the invasion of Guadalcanal. The lessons learned at Midway, the importance of intelligence, the power of coordinated carrier operations, and the value of tactical flexibility, would guide American strategy for the remainder of the conflict. The Battle of Midway had proven that tactical brilliance, when combined with intelligence advantages and extraordinary courage, could overcome seemingly impossible odds. In 4 minutes of dive bomber attacks, the course of the Pacific War had been changed forever, setting the stage for an American offensive that would culminate 3 years later in Tokyo Bay.